At the beginning of April of 1812, the walls of Badajoz crumbled under British bombardment. The siege of Badajoz, one of the bloodiest sieges in the Napoleonic Wars, was approaching its pinnacle. An assault on the city was soon to begin, during which almost 4,000 men would lose their lives in less than 3 hours. This attack and the merciless plundering that followed the city's conquest made the siege of Badajoz tragically infamous. Among other things, this battle provides the historical context for Bernard Cornwell's novel Sharpe and the film based on it, Sharpe's Company. In this video we explain how modern historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of Badajoz. This video is brought to you by Forge of Empires, the strategy game where you build and develop your own city through history from the Stone Age to the Space Age. Your mission is to expand your empire, create and lead armies, and conquer new lands with turn-based tactical battles. Each unit type interacts in a rock-paper-scissors style, so strategic thinking is key. You can engage in world map expansion or PvP, take part in exciting tournaments and guild battles, collect blueprints to build iconic historical landmarks like the Colosseum and the Notre Dame. Forge of Empires is available cross-platform on iOS, Android and in your browser right now. The game frequently hosts new events, quests and updates, with exclusive rewards, themed buildings and in-game boosts to keep the gameplay exciting. Download Forge of Empires by scanning the QR code or clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. And get access to additional rewards, such as 25 Forge points, 1000 coins and 1000 supplies. For completing the tutorial and reaching the Bronze Age, you get access to the Welcome event, where you also receive 150 raffle tickets and 2 golden dice throws. In 1810, Napoleon Bonaparte occupied most of the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish and Portuguese put up fierce resistance. They were supported by the British army under Arthur Wesley, who later became the Duke of Wellington. Wellington had succeeded in stabilizing the situation and securing Lisbon with the lines of Torres Vedras, a belt of fortifications built by the British engineer Richard Fletcher. While Napoleon was busy preparing his famous Russian campaign in 1811, Wellington seized the opportunity to lead the allied Anglo-Portuguese army on the offensive. Before advancing into Spain, he first had to capture the 2 most important border fortresses, Ciudad Rodrigo in the north and Badajoz in the south. Wellington first turned his attention to Badajoz. His troops besieged the city for several weeks, but failed to break the garrison's resistance. At the Battle of Albuera on the 16th of May 1811, the Allies fended off an initial attempt to liberate the city by the French Marshal Jean de Diez-Soult. But when the assembled French troops under Auguste de Marmont confronted them around a month later, Wellington was forced to abandon the siege. However, an opportunity soon arose to attack the other border fortress, Ciudad Rodrigo. Napoleon ordered Marmont to send some of his troops to the east to support Louis-Gabriel Suchet in the conquest of Valencia. Wellington reacted immediately. He marched to Ciudad Rodrigo, surrounded the city on the 7th of January 1812, and stormed it on the night of the 19th to the 20th of January. With the northern fortress in hand, Badajoz was the only missing key to Spain. Heavy rain set at the end of January. This made the almost 250-kilometer march south even more arduous. The roads were so muddy that the animals hauling the heavy guns were slow to a crawl. While his men made their way south, Wellington remained up north to prevent the French from finding out that a second attack on Badajoz was imminent. When he arrived in Elvas, a town west of the Portuguese border, on the 11th of March, the preparations for the siege were almost complete, and most of the Allied army had gathered in the region of Extremadura. Wellington himself took command of the 27,000 men from the 3rd, 4th, 5th and Light Divisions besieging Badajoz, while General Rowland Hill shielded the north against Marmont with 14,000 men, and General Thomas Graham covered the south against Soult and Drouet with 19,000 men. On the 15th of March, Wellington built a pontoon bridge over the Guadiana about 15 kilometers south of Badajoz, crossed the river and surrounded the city. Wellington extensively scouted the defenses, and discovered that Badajoz had been considerably reinforced since the previous year. Fort San Cristobal on the north bank of the river and Fort Pardelaras to the southwest of the city were better fortified. Minefields had been laid to the west of the city, while in the east the Rivala stream had been dammed, creating a natural barrier. Finally, a new fort, Fort Picarina, had been built in the southeast. Badajoz was even harder to crack than the year before. Wellington and his chief engineer, Richard Fletcher, could not agree on a line of attack. Wellington wanted to approach the town from the south, but Fletcher believed they had too few men and guns to support this plan. Instead, he suggested capturing Fort Picarina first, and then breaching the southeastern walls. Although Wellington did not like his engineer interfering with his planning, he realized Fletcher was right, and grudgingly agreed. While the Allies prepared for the attack, many civilians left the city. The French governor, Armand Philippon, was happy to let them go. They were useless to him and their loyalty was questionable. In addition, this exodus allowed him to secretly send messages to Soult and Marmont asking for help. The governor had around 5,000 men at his disposal and supplies for 6 or 7 weeks, but he was short on ammunition. Nevertheless, the city's guns maintained a dense barrage right from the outset of the siege. A heavy thunderstorm raged on the evening of the 17th of March, providing the attackers with the necessary cover to open the trenches. About 250 meters away from Fort Picarina, on a slight elevation, 1,800 men dug the first parallel. They were still at work when the French surprised them with a large-scale sortie on the 19th of March. Around 1,000 infantry and 40 cavalry stormed out of the fortress at midday and charged the men in the trenches. The battle was chaotic, but the Allies finally managed to push the French back. During the battle, a bullet hit Richard Fletcher's wallet and drove a coin into his stomach, forcing him to retreat to his tent. From then on, Wellington paid the badly wounded man a daily visit to confer with him. He could easily have replaced Fletcher, but this arrangement had 2 advantages. It honored the engineer's achievements, and it gave Wellington a freer hand in determining the course of action. The second half of March brought no improvements in the weather. The rain made working on the trenches more difficult and caused the Guadiana to flood so severely that on the 22nd of March the raging waters washed away the pontoon bridge, cutting the Allies' supply line. Only a few days later, on the 24th of March, the first parallel was finally ready. The guns were immediately put in position, and on the following day, the British began to return fire. Their gunners aimed partly at Fort Picarina and partly at the town itself. Their main goal was to force the defenders into a defensive position by shooting at their parapets. This provided the necessary cover for an assault detachment to approach Fort Picarina and storm it at nightfall. To the surprise of both sides, the resistance was not particularly fierce. Only slightly more than 300 men fell in the attack. After capturing the fort, Wellington pressed forward. The very next night, his men began working on a second parallel and building more gun emplacements, including some breaching batteries. The position of these heavy guns, meant to destroy the walls, revealed to the defenders exactly where the Allies would attack. They reinforced the corresponding section with a second line of defense and prepared for the worst. On the 30th of March, the new batteries were ready. When they opened fire, they followed a method that had proved successful for Wellington. They made several breaches, close enough for the attacking troops to support each other if they broke through, but far enough apart that the defenders of one breach couldn't see what was happening in the others. The situation became increasingly precarious for the defenders. The governor, Philippon, hoped that help would soon arrive from the French field armies, but his hopes were in vain. Soult was still in Seville, Drouet was facing Graham with only 12,000 men, and Marmont, who wanted to march south to confront Wellington, had direct orders from Napoleon not to intervene. Instead, he was to gather his troops at Salamanca and threaten Portugal to lure Wellington away from Badajoz. But Wellington had no intention of abandoning the siege. His breaching batteries made good progress, and at the beginning of April, the walls began to give way in 2 places. On the 5th of April, Wellington inspected the breaches to see if they were practicable, that is, sufficiently wide and level to storm. When he noticed the defenders had massively reinforced the main breach, he postponed the attack. Launching an assault this early was highly unusual. Typically, the attackers drove the trenches right up to the fortress and conquered the fortress step by step before breaching the walls, which usually included another parallel, the 3rd parallel, which was never built at Badajoz. In most cases, this prompted the garrison to surrender. Assaults on large fortresses were rarely ordered in Napoleon's time, because they were extremely risky and almost always resulted in significant casualties. In most cases, they were doomed to fail because the defenders were at a great advantage. Wellington knew what awaited his men, but he nevertheless believed such an attack was the most promising option, and that he, quote, had brought matters to that state where we could do no more, and it was necessary to storm or raise the siege. When the guns made a 3rd breach on the 6th of April, he gave the order to attack. The offense began at 20 minutes to 10. Wellington's soldiers attacked a lunette of SandRhoman and conquered it quickly. The troops then tried to drain the dam upstream to facilitate the assault on the breaches, but the water drained very slowly. At about the same time, the 3rd Division under Lieutenant General Thomas Picton attacked the castle. It advanced against the outer walls with several ladders, but came under heavy fire. When Picton was seriously wounded, his men attempted to climb the wall between 2 bastions. Despite being caught in deadly crossfire, they managed to get the ladders in place. A handful of men even made it onto the walls, only to be immediately mowed down by the defenders. After several attempts and massive losses, the 3rd Division retreated. Meanwhile, the attack on the breaches had begun. As the men of the 4th and Light Divisions advanced, they encountered surprisingly little resistance at first, and a large part of the Forlorn Hope entered the breach without difficulty. It was a trap. The breach was mined, and as the attackers advanced, a sudden explosion engulfed the opening in flames, wiping out nearly the entire first wave. An eyewitness wrote, quote, "If hell is as bad as that ditch was, it is a worse place than I took it for." Undeterred, Wellington's men launched repeated attacks, concentrating on the central breach, the most heavily fortified, while the other 2 breaches were largely overlooked. After dozens of assaults, some men finally managed to climb the breach. When they reached the top, they received an unpleasant surprise. The French light artillery and their musketeers had entrenched themselves behind a line of logs and beams spiked with swords and bayonets. Wellington stood on a hill and watched his men continue the attack for almost 2 hours. Again and again, a brave soul managed to rally an attacking party, but again and again they were shot down by the French. The carnage was horrific, and the breaches soon filled with corpses. Despite their determination, the attackers eventually abandoned their attempt to storm. With the failure of the main attack, the side attacks, originally only intended as diversions, were the final hope. When the men of the 3rd Division saw that the French were focused on the breaches, they ventured out of cover again and tried to storm the castle. To their surprise, they succeeded on their first attempt. They scaled the wall at the lowest point, entered the castle, and soon had it secured. The French noticed the intruders and quickly surrounded them, but it became evident that the city would be untenable if the 3rd Division managed to defend the castle until dawn. At around midnight, the 5th Division on the city's other side also advanced. Originally, it was only supposed to feint an attack, but now the men seized the opportunity and charged the bastion of St. Vincent. Despite substantial resistance, the soldiers made it over the ditch, to the wall and up the ladders. After gaining a foothold, the men fought their way along the wall toward the breaches, capturing 3 bastions before being repelled by the French. However, their efforts no longer mattered. Their advance had given the rest of the division time to climb over the wall and enter the city. The 3rd Division, on the other side of the city, immediately broke out of the castle and joined forces with their comrades, and together they fought their way to the breach. When the French realized the Allies were in their back, the resistance collapsed almost immediately. Now, a scene of horror unfolded. Wellington's soldiers, consumed by a desire for retribution, abandoned all discipline, order, and decency. They looted, raped, and murdered the civilians they were supposed to liberate from the French. Captain Robert Blakeney again conjured up images of hell to describe the horrors. Quote, "The infuriated soldiery resembled rather a pack of hellhounds vomited up by the infernal regions for the extirpation of mankind than what they were." Wellington's pride in the determination and self-sacrifice of his men quickly turned to anger. Military historians regard the sack of Badajoz as one of the worst actions of Wellington's troops. This greatly contributed to their nickname Scum of the Earth. Armand Philippon exploited the confusion to retreat to San Cristobal. Nevertheless, he surrendered the following day and handed his city over to Wellington. The Allies paid an immense price for this victory. The assault alone had cost the lives of almost 4,000 men, and the blood tax of the entire siege was even higher. The triumph was costly, but Wellington had achieved his strategic goal. He now controlled both border fortresses, and the road to Spain was wide open. Don't forget to check out the sponsor of this video, Forge of Empires. Click the link in the description below or scan the QR code on screen to claim your special rewards.